Thank you, Commissioners. Your endurance in getting to this point to be commended. I hope you can see the screen, which says a presentation, and you have a paper copy of it on which you can make some notes. I'd like to address two key gas project assertions that are made by Santos and by others, but are not based on any evidence and which subjectively distort the perceived benefits and the costs of the Narrabri gas project. First, I'd like to address the claim that NGP gas will lower prices for New South Wales. This is wrong. The price of gas on the East Coast is set by the price that the LNG plants in Queensland are willing to pay to meet their 1,400 petajoules a year of contractual obligations. This was forecast, acknowledged and understood by New South Wales IPART in 2014, subsequently by other commentators, who correctly observed that a partially full LNG train will result in the linkage of the East Coast gas price to the global LNG price, which is itself linked to oil prices. You can see on a plot in the presentation how quickly the LNG netback price and the short-term trading market STTM price rapidly converged after the LNG plants started using gas from the eastern coast. This market dynamic is simple and unarguable, but it's actually rarely acknowledged. Unless there is more gas available than is needed by the LNG plants and for domestic use, the East Coast gas price, the clearing price, is simply set by the alternative market for gas, the price of LNG. Currently, and under any reasonable forecast scenario, the LNG plants will continue to remain undersupplied, and the NGP is simply too small to fill this continuing LNG supply gap, and so it cannot conceivably reduce the price of gas in New South Wales or the East Coast. As the NGP gas volume is inadequate in volume to reduce the price of East Coast gas, which is effectively the same as a homogeneous market on the East Coast, I have detailed in the presentation a number of ways in which the price of gas could be reduced, as this seems to be the goal to which gas consumers and politicians at federal and state level alike are committed. There are two practical ways in which this could be achieved. One or two of the LNG trains in Queensland could be shut in, which would result in the required excess of production over demand, which would reduce domestic gas prices.
What do you mean by shut in? Do you mean kept for the domestic market?
If an LNG train was shut in, that would free up 200 to 300 petajoules a year for the domestic market.
Right.
Or if an LNG import terminal is deployed in New South Wales, I happen to think Port Kembla is the best location, that would provide a cap on prices that producers could charge the East Coast gas market. Currently, 1 to 3 year gas contracts in New South Wales, you need to pay $9 to $10 a gigajoule, where the clearing price at Wallumbilla LNG is only $7. We're paying a $2 to $3 premium to the LNG clearing price, and that would actually make an import terminal quite viable. Given time, and all of this is actually set out in detail in the presentation. I can take some questions at the end on the market. It's actually very simple. You've just got a very big buyer that can't be filled, and that sets the price for the market. Secondly, I'd like to address the claims that Narrabri gas has low CO2. The well data in Narrabri, available from 1998 when the first well was drilled up until 2014, there are 40 wells and 1,000 samples. I was requested to do the analysis on this. I spent years in the oil and gas industry looking at wellhead samples and subsurface samples, so I'm qualified to do this. I analysed the thousands of samples and the 40 samples, over 40 wells in the NGP area. The data in the formation, you can see that basically, if you go to the slide, the average CO2 content over the whole project area is about 25%. It's about 33% in the Hoskissons formation, which interestingly, Keith Spence at the AGM Santos said they weren't interested in producing from. This is very interesting because it actually forms a plank of Santos's EIS for the project. And so if they are not going to produce from the high CO2 Hoskissons formation, then the EIS needs to be done again. The Maules Creek formation, which Santos did say they were targeting at the AGM, they claimed that 250 samples, which no one is allowed to see, show that it's 5% CO2, when the 1,000 samples that I, with 30 years of experience looking at this data, analysed, show that the actual CO2 percentage was at least 25 to 30%, and there are some scenarios in which it could actually be considerably higher. The data is all available. I can make it available to the Commission, but at the very least, what we think should be done, since there's a claim that Narrabri will be cheap, low-cost gas, and it will be clean gas, it won't be cheap, and it certainly won't be clean at a CO2 content of 30% CO2. And I believe that a condition of any further consideration of the project would involve Santos making available the 250 samples that it says show low CO2 and all the other data shows something quite different. And that's actually assessed by a competent independent petroleum or oil and gas engineer.
Could you please wrap up now? Thanks, Andrew.
Righto. If you'd like a question, I can very quickly answer.
Yeah, can you just go to the page 4 of your presentation? Yeah. Can you just, sorry, just let me get mine in order. Sorry, go to page 3 if you wouldn't mind. Can you just explain that table to the commissioners, where the table that commences with demand at 2025? What are you pointing out in relation to that table? Through that table.
Okay, the point of that table is that the entire Eastern Coast demand, and Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and act as one market effectively.
Yep.
That whole market is comprised of 1,300 to 1,400 petajoules a year, which have to go to LNG.
Yep.
And there's about 530 petajoules a year which go to the domestic users. So you can see that 3/4 of the gas produced in the eastern states needs to go to fill LNG plants. That's what that table is. Santos currently is short 1.8 million tonnes per annum of LNG. That requires about 100 petajoules per annum. That would explain why they're so keen to try and get Narrabri, because the commercial cost of them is sort of $9 a gigajoule if they don't meet their contractual commitments. So LNG is taking 1,300 to 1,400 petajoules a year, and that sits there taking gas at the price that LNG is structured at under the contracts, and so sucks all of that gas out of the market, effectively sets the market price.
Right. And can I just ask you, on pages 6 and 7, where exactly are you getting the CO2 content data for the Hoskissons seam and the Maules Creek formation, 33% and 22%?
I went through every single well. Basically, the DIGS, the Geological Survey of New South Wales, makes appraiser well data available that's more than 5 years old. Right. So all the appraiser well data that has gas samples is available on there. From my training, I go through, I pull out the depth in the wells, use the well completion reports. Everything's actually conveniently there on the Geological Survey. Then you look at the gas samples and the depth, and there's other detail here. I plotted up by depth the CO2. It's just a question of finding the sample that was taken in the coal, plotting it up and analysing it and averaging it. It's just laborious, methodical and annoying. But when you do it, the data is actually pretty incontrovertible. So there's a well completion report, there are gas sample reports, there are gas composition analysis. These are all there. You can actually look at them, and we've actually collected them in one place and provide them. I have a website that there's a summary table you could pull down now with every single well setting out what the samples were, the numbers of the samples and the data. It's just a data exercise.
All right, thank you.
Can I just ask a question, given your years of working in the industry? Have you got any comments you'd like to make about what the potential fugitive emissions might be with this project proceeded?
Based on the correct use of the correct CO2, which is about 25 to 30%. I think that's actually being charitable. I think that's being higher. Santos has two cases. They have one in which they use their own gas for fuel. Mm-hmm. Now, you get into a tail chasing. The higher your CO2, the more fuel you have to use to actually get rid of the CO2, because you have an energy-intensive amine process that does that. When you properly account for that energy and you properly account for fuel use, if the project had its own fuel use, it would have an emissions intensity for electricity generation from gas from the project of about 1.7, seven to 8, 0.7 to 0.8 tonnes per megawatt hour of electricity. If Santos has proposed they use electricity from the grid to actually remove the CO2 from from the gas, so they get more sales gas. The overall intensity from the would actually rise up to about 1. That's actually a plot on page 5. The emissions intensity correctly incorporating the CO2, which is actually in the formations, would be exactly the same as coal. There'd be no benefit. You'd be putting about 2 million tonnes of CO2 a year into the atmosphere because they take the CO2 out of the gas, they put that, remove that and put that up a stack, then the CO2 goes to a generator, is burnt and puts more CO2 up the stack. When you add those together, you basically get the same as coal emissions.
Thank you, Andrew. I think Snow might have a question.
Yes.
Mr. Grogan, back to the CO2 levels, you stated that you have analysed the publicly available figures, which are up to 214, I think you said, something like that.
Yes. The data after that is confidential, yes.
Yeah. Those, from your experience in the industry, those wells have probably been drilled at slightly different places, but still into the same seams. So what's the possibility that the wells that Santos have drilled, which we can't get the data for, have actually got lower CO2, or are they likely to be the same CO2 as were reported in the 214?
It's a very good question. There are actually only 2 wells drilled after 2015. So the 250, it's where the 250 samples come from, I don't know. There are channels and tracks. If you go to page 7 of the presentation, you'll see how the CO2 is mapped. There are areas within the project area that do have low CO2. If you look down the southwest corner, there's a few wells that are quite low. Whether Santos is only producing those because they're making gas for the Narrabri power station, and if they're producing the low CO2 wells and sampling them, then of course they'll get low CO2 samples. But when you drill appraisal wells, you drill them over the whole area. And if you look at page 7 of the presentation, those are wells over the whole project area. If you're selectively producing, if I look at that, I can see some low CO2 areas, maybe 20, 30% of the area. That has to have major implications for the size of the resource that is actually low CO2. But without knowing about these samples, the provenance, the location, the timing, and what these samples are of Santos, I'm forced to discount them because there's just actually no detail behind them. I can only look at wide aerial coverage as on slide 7. I can only look at what the data says, and I go as an experienced engineer. That's over the whole project area. Yes, there are some good areas. In the main, it's looking pretty unfortunate. If Mount Capitar is a mountain near Narrabri, I grew up in the shadow of Mount Capitar, funnily enough. It's an igneous volcanic plug. And any geologist will tell you that if you have igneous rocks under shallow coals, then they are probably have very high CO2. And the reason is that igneous rocks emit CO2 and coal absorbs it. The geology is actually quite simple.
Thank you.
So the easiest way around this would be for Santos to make public data after 2015 and these 250 samples.
That you've anticipated my question. Andrew, what justification is given for the CO2 content after 2014 or 15, wherever it is, being confidential?
There's no justification. The way that exploration data works under most regimes is that data before a certain time becomes publicly available. That usually applies to well data. Production data is usually always confidential. Whether that's in the public interest or not is another issue. I believe that it should be available. And I think that it's convenient in this case to hide behind the veil of commerciality, enduring confidentiality on the production data, which I contacted the Geological Survey, and they're not allowed to make it available without Santos' permission, which was not forthcoming. One wonders why. And the well data, as I say, there were only 2 wells drilled after 2015, and I can't see how 2 wells stacked up against 40 could actually make a difference in the analysis. So there's a lot of missing information, which if it was brought out transparently and assessed by someone who knew what they were doing, we could have some knowledge. Right now we only have the knowledge from the 40 wells, and that says it's 30% CO2.
Andrew, we have a question from John as well.
Yes, Andrew, we've heard from a number of presenters over the last couple of days in regard to differing views on the cost of production and that the Narrabri gas project is either a low cost or a high cost facility. With your industry experience, where would it sit on the cost curve?
Well, there's two answers to that question. The cost of gas is one thing, the price of gas is another.
Understood.
And that's actually, if you go to slide 4, you will see that I have plotted where Narrabri sits in terms of the marginal cost curve. And I have plotted, you on slide 4?
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, top right hand. It has the clearing price of LNG, which is the red dot and where the NGP gas would sit.
Right.
And it has the contract price that we're currently seeing right now at that oil price, which is the $9. You can see that at the AEMO costs of $7.40, which I believe is probably reasonable. And the reason is it's a greenfield development with no existing infrastructure. It needs another pipeline, and the resource quality is not that high. Those numbers are pretty reasonable. And they could be assessed by someone else. But I doubt very much that it's cheap gas. I've looked at the numbers. $8 seems reasonable, if nothing else. You can see that $8 is under the value to Santos of $9, and that's due to some effects in terms of non-performance under LNG contracts. But it doesn't change the fact that if any producer, whatever the cost of the gas, and Santos is producing some gas from the Cooper Basin at $1 a gigajoule, it's kind of irrelevant. The fact is that they sell that gas at $9 a gigajoule. So what's most important is how the price is set and not the cost of the gas. If the cost of the project is $10 a gigajoule and Santos wants to proceed with it, that's really a matter for Santos' shareholders. We shouldn't be concerned with that. What we're concerned with, well, it means that the profits and the royalties and the taxes will be considerably reduced, of course. But what appears to be the prime focus is the price of gas. And that remains at sort of $9 when the clearing price is $7, and it will be at $9 unless the volume is higher. The principal issue here is volume. It's not the cost to produce, but as in any marginal cost curve, you'll see on the one in green, as you start to produce the least desirable reserves, they have the highest costs, and eventually you get to a point where you just cannot satisfy the market at the price that the market will pay.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
That concludes our questions. Thanks, Andrew. Move